Good time. All right. Anyway, I just took attendance, so if you did hear anything, you didn't miss anything. The first word for attendance is Alexis, the name Alexis. And before we get started, some announcements. I should mention this a lot earlier, but I'll show you guys have figured it out. We're not really going to meet for lab today, because today's lab is watching a video. So there's no need for us to all sit here with headphones, right? So you do your own thing. Just make sure you watch the video before Friday. Preferably by today. You have, from 10 to about 12 when your schedule is set to be in lab, right? So if I were you, I would take advantage of that time, knock this video out, and then move forward. But are there any questions about anything else before we jump into the material? Oh yeah, also, we just finished Module 6. So if you missed anything, like a quiz or an exam, you need to get in touch with me. Because quiz 6 and exam 3 were due on Sunday, and that's something else I forgot to mention Monday. Like I said, I was under the weather. Anyway, if no one has any questions, let's get started. Get out of here. And go over here. All right, so last thing we finished talking about was the evidence of evolution. Now we're really going to dig into natural selection as the mechanism, as one of the mechanisms, as the big mechanism for evolution. So we've already talked about natural selection a little bit. So a lot of this is a review. So now we're really going to get into it a little bit deeper than we have. So there will be some new concepts. And again, in my opinion, this is how I like to teach and to study. We kind of scratch the surface and memorize all the big picture stuff. Then once you know that stuff, then start adding the details, which is exactly what we are about to do. But before we even talk about natural selection, let's talk about something called artificial selection. So Darwin reasoned that artificial selection, which is the selective breeding of domesticated plants and animals to promote the occurrence of desirable traits and offspring, was key to understanding evolutionary change. So you definitely need to know the difference between artificial selection and natural selection. So obviously artificial selection is not when nature selects who survives and who doesn't, therefore who has more offspring and who doesn't, right? This is when humans are doing it, specifically when it comes to domesticated plants and animals. And that picture there is a great example. Horses all used to they're still the same species, but humans got horses and we artificially bred them, right? We used artificial selection to make some of them really, really big, to make some of them really, really small. Same with cats and dogs and some other examples I'll give you a little bit later. But are there any questions about what artificial selection is? All right, and again, we're going to talk a little bit more about it. And again, even though we're about to talk about natural selection, first, the old textbook wanted to explain how artificial selection works, and then we kind of wrap in how natural selection. It's basically the same thing, other than who's making the decisions. So, artificial selection has two essential components. And spoiler, so does natural selection, the same two essential components. The first one is variation among individuals, and heritability, which is the transmission of a trait from one parent to the offspring, right? Those are the two essential components. Just like you learned with the black moth, right? The peppered moth simulation. There wasn't at first, but after that mutation, then there was a variation among the individuals, right? They had different types. And the darker ones which was heritable, or heritable. The darker ones just happened to have an advantage once everything got polluted, and then therefore they could hide from predators. And again, that's a natural selection example. Here we're talking about artificial selection, and a good example of this, that's a picture from one of our scientists here in the building, Dr. Reddy. He breeds watermelons and studies different things about them, but that's a good example how there's variation, right? These are all watermelons of the same species, obviously different breeds, and you can see the variation. There's longer ones, and there's rounder ones, and bigger ones, and smaller ones, and darker green ones, and lighter green ones, and even a yellow one, right? So this is just a handful of the different varieties of watermelon. But yes, another great example of artificial selection. And also, I'll remind you, speaking of all this stuff I'm telling you, don't forget, easy independent work would be like, look up what I'm telling you, and like say, yep, I looked it up, and you said this, and according to this source, they say the same thing, or they say something different, whatever the case may be. So Darwin knew that individuals and natural populations also have small but measurable differences, aka the variation that we talked about earlier, and we're going to talk about it even more later. But what he didn't know was what forces determined which individuals became the breeding stock for the next generation. So with artificial selection, obviously the humans were determining which individuals became the breeding stock, right? So again, I don't know, using dogs as an example, somebody was breeding dogs and they wanted to make a large breed of dogs, and when they had a bunch of dogs at their disposal, they would pick the two biggest ones and make them, right? They would do that in generations after generation. That was humans, right? That was artificial selection. Didn't know what was happening with natural selection. Not at first. Obviously, he figured it out eventually. So in the meantime, there was a guy named Thomas Malthus who contended that human disease, famine, and war were consequences of human populations increasing faster than food supplies and other resources. It kind of makes sense. Well, not always, but a lot of times, we very often fighting over stuff, whether that stuff be land or oil or something like that, or food sometimes, water. So Darwin then applied Malthus's idea to populations of plants and animals. Well, not just plants and animals, but all living things, populations in general. Reasoning that resources of any given environment are limited, right? There's no such thing as infinite, whatever it is that you need. There's no such thing as infinite water, infinite air, infinite places to hide, infinite food supply, right? Resources of any given environment are limited. And granted, some are more limited than others, but yes, they are limited. He also reasoned that the production of more individuals than the environment can support leads to a struggle for existence. And then finally, he reasoned that only some offspring survive in each generation. Now, those 3 bullet points are pretty important. I don't know about the exam, but at least it's for understanding how natural selection works, right? So this is basically how it works. Life is a struggle to survive. Obviously, for humans, for most of us, we don't necessarily struggle to survive. But for most other living things, they're constantly trying to find a place to eat, a place to drink, a place not to get killed, right? It's a struggle to survive. So that brings us to this idea of unequal reproduction. Individuals whose traits better enable them to survive and reproduce more successfully pass those traits off to their offspring. And this is what we call adaptation. Right? Adaptation is a result of unequal reproduction. Because again, they're having more offspring than the environment can support. Therefore, only the stronger ones, the ones that are better adapted to that environment, those are the ones who survive. Those are the ones who will reproduce and pass along those traits. So therefore, those traits that made it successful are the traits that will be passed down. So Darwin figured that if artificial selection could bring such big changes in a relatively short amount of time, then surely natural selection could modify species considerably over hundreds or thousands or maybe millions of generations. That's finally how we got to this, right? So thinking about artificial selection and how it worked, he then just figured it all out. So, oh, if humans could do that so quickly, surely nature could do that over millions of years. And that's basically it in a nutshell. And a good concept for independent work, again, if you want to talk about artificial selection, think about most of the foods you eat. You can look that up. See what they used to look like before humans got involved. We started this chapter with me showing you a little picture of a little cherry tomato, because that's what all tomatoes used to look like, right? Until we got in there and changed it. Broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, that's all the same species of plant. But due to artificial selection, some people took them this way, some people took them that way. Now we have these different crops for the same species. Watermelons used to be the size of my fist, basically not juicy, not sweet, and barely edible until humans got involved. So again, good independent work topic if you want to get into it. Think of a food, or multiple foods if you want, a crop. Think about how they used to look before humans got involved. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right, let's do the next slide here. The next main bullet point, we're going to talk about natural selection in action. And again, a lot of this is what you already know because I've already given it to you. Except now, in some of this, we're going to dig a little bit deeper, maybe give you a few new terms. Evolutionary change has been documented in thousands of scientific studies, right? So again, evolution is happening. That's all there is to it. We've seen it happening. It's happening currently, and you might not believe that's where we came from, but that's okay. That's a belief. I can't prove where we came from. There's a lot of evidence for that, but we do see currently evolution is happening. The old textbook gives it an unsettling example of natural selection, which is pesticide resistance in insects. Now, I'm going to put a big question mark next to this. I'm not sure I'm going to ask you this, any questions about this pesticide resistance thing, but it really is a great example of natural selection. And it's borderline, in my opinion, it's borderline artificial selection because humans are kind of responsible for this. Now, granted, it's not technically artificial selection because humans aren't doing this on purpose. Like, oh, let's breed some really strong insects. It's kind of like an accidental artificial selection. But anyway, let's talk about it. So let's say a farmer puts a small amount of poison on the crops, insecticide, so he can kill the insects, and it does. It kills most of the insects that they're after. But subsequent applications, as they put it on time after time, become less and less effective. The reason is because those who survive each round of it they're genetically resistant, right? There's something about them that made them resistant to that poison. Maybe they were almost dead, right? But something about them made them survive. So they had that allele, they had those genetics that allowed them to survive. Therefore, since they survived, they're the ones that reproduced. Therefore, those genetics that they had made them resistant to the insecticide, was then passed down to the new generation. And all the ones that had something weak about them, if you want to say that, the ones that had the genetics that made them susceptible to the poison, they died. So that they didn't pass along their bad genes, right? It was only the good genes that were passed along. Thus, the proportion of pesticide-resistant individuals increases in each generation until eventually you're left with nothing but insecticide-resistant population. So here's a good visualization. You can see here they're spraying the pesticides. You can see here this population. A bunch of them have the green allele, and then a couple of them have the red allele. Turns out the red allele, for some reason, makes them impervious to the pesticide. So all the weak ones die, the red ones survive, they reproduce, and then therefore the rest of the new population is all pesticide resistant. Any questions about that? It's common sense, right? It really is common sense. Something about them that allowed them to survive was going to be passed along to the next generation because they survived and because they were allowed to reproduce. And I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the chapter, but another good example of this, so I'm going to say it now just in case it's not on the PowerPoint and I forgot. But antibiotic resistance is a lot like this too. So this is why they say very often, like when you get antibiotics, they say make sure you take it for the whole 10 days. Even when you start to feel better, you still have to take it because what's happened is when you first take your antibiotics, you kill most of it, right? Especially all the weak ones, all the weak and bacteria, you kill them. Some of them are stronger, and you want to make sure you keep taking that antibiotic so you kill them. Otherwise, what you've done is you've killed all the weak antibiotics, and now since you stopped taking the antibiotics, you've killed all the weak bacteria. And because you stop taking the antibiotics, then those weak ones are allowed to reproduce, and therefore the new population of bacteria in you are resistant to the antibiotics. So that's very important. That's important for your everyday life, right? It could result in some serious health consequences. Anyway, any questions about this slide before we move on to the next main bullet point? All right, let's talk about some key points about natural selection. The next word for attendance is the word faith, and the name faith. F-I-T-H. So this is really important, not necessarily for grading, because it's kind of hard to put some of this information into questions. But it's very important for you to truly understand how natural selection works. Natural selection is more of an editing process than a creative mechanism, right? It can only amplify or diminish heritable traits that are already there. It can't create them, right? So for example, using those moths as an example, being black was an advantage after the pollution came. But natural selection didn't result in those first black moths, right? That was just an accident. It just happened to be a mutation. And that mutation just happened to lead to this advantage that allowed it to be amplified, right? Natural selection did not create that blackness in those models. Another example we're going to use in this chapter is sickle cell. Even though so far we've only talked about it as a mutation and a disease, and it still is a mutation and disease. But in some situations, sickle cell gave people an advantage in sub-Saharan Africa. Because of that, those people survive more. Because of that, right now, sickle cell disease is more prominent in populations from people who came from sub-Saharan Africa. But it wasn't natural selection that created sickle cell disease. It was a random mutation, right? So that random mutation created that advantage in that case, or that heritable trait, and it was only natural selection that happened to amplify it, right? Or excuse me, let me reword that to make sure that's clear. Natural selection amplified that. It didn't create that mutation. Another good example is one we talked about on Monday. Remember I talked about how humans cannot create our own vitamin C, right? So if we could create natural selection, if nature could, then why would that happen, right? That was a freak mutation that actually hasn't helped anything, right? Therefore, if it was process-driven or a creative mechanism, then that would never happen, right? There would be no creation of a bad gene, right? Because that's really only hurt us. Anyway, the second point here is that organisms can acquire characteristics that help it survive, and these acquired characteristics cannot be passed on to offspring. So there's so many examples of this, like fish who are a chameleon. That's a great example, right? A chameleon can change its colors, but it won't change. It's not like it changes it to one color, like it changes from green to orange, and then it's orange forever, and it passes along those orange characteristics. It doesn't do that. But anyway, yeah, I would say this middle bullet point is the most important of these three, or these first two, actually. This one and this one are the most important. Natural selection is an editing process. It's not a creative mechanism. It's not goal-oriented, right? It just so happens there's variations, heritable variations, and natural selection just amplifies some of them or diminishes others. But it doesn't create these heritable traits. So any questions about this slide? All right, let's go to the next one. Beat the dead horse a little bit more. Natural selection is not goal-directed, right? It does not lead to perfectly adapted organisms. It helps, but it doesn't make them perfectly adapted. And I know I'm not, so I won't go through this again because I've already bored you with it enough. And on Monday, I talked about some of the flaws in the humans, right? We have a lot of flaws in our design. We're not perfectly adapted. We're the best we can be, and I'm sure we're going to keep getting better, especially as the environment changes, but we're not perfectly adapted. So a trait that is favorable in one situation may be useless or even detrimental in different circumstances. That's another thing to keep in mind. And another, going back to the same example I used before, obviously sickle cell disease can be bad, it can be deadly, it can lead to a lot of uncomfortable symptoms, which is unfavorable, right? But in some situations, which we'll talk about later, that is favorable. Therefore, again, sometimes, and using that as an example, more people had sickle cell over time because in that different circumstance, it was advantageous. The book example is this, the finches. Finches with large bills were benefited in one climate, while small bills were disadvantageous. In a different climate, the relationship reversed. In other words, if you look, studies have been done, and I think the textbook actually goes into a lot more detail than I did. That's just one little bullet point. But they looked at a population of finches over time, and they changed over time as the environment changed over time. So again, basically what that's saying is the one with the big bills, hey, that was an advantage. They had an advantage over the small bills. And then things changed in the environment, and then all of a sudden having a big bill wasn't advantageous, and having a small bill was advantageous. So any questions about that slide? Okay. Now we're really going to get into it. This is more of the stuff, I wish we could have done it earlier. This is more of the stuff that we did last week in lab. So we're talking about the evolution of the population, but we're not just talking about natural selection anymore. Now we're talking about evolution in general. Remember, natural selection is just one type of evolution, right? And then we're really going to get into it on the next bullet point. Here we go. What Darwin did not know. Darwin did not know how variations that are the raw material for natural selection arise in the population. So just like I was saying earlier, natural selection, or any type of evolution, does not create these changes, right? The changes are there, the variation is there, and natural selection or any evolution either amplifies it or diminishes it, right? It doesn't create this variation. So Darwin didn't know where that variation came from. He also did not know how these variations were passed along from parent to offspring. Like, he knew they were passed along, otherwise he wouldn't have come up with what he came up with, but he didn't know exactly how. In other words, what we're saying here is he didn't know about genetics, right? Because he was doing his work about the same time that Mendel was doing his work, a little bit after. But remember, Mendel and his work didn't become famous until after he had died. So Darwin didn't know that Mendel had already answered these questions. So all the stuff that you learned previously about mitosis and meiosis and genetics, and even a little bit about microbiology, molecular biology, he didn't know all that stuff. If he did, it would have been like he would have really known that his theory was correct. But now you know, he just didn't. So any questions about that side? All right, let's talk about how these variations that are the raw material for natural selection arise in the population. I've already said it. So when I first introduced you to mutations, I told you this is it. This is the raw material for evolution. So individual variation occurs in all species, obviously some more than other. Most populations have obvious physical differences and a phenotypic variation observed only at the molecular level, right? So those two different things. So sometimes you can really look, like for humans, I would say it's kind of easy usually to look at a human and distinguish them from another human. They got obvious physical differences. Then also, if you were to look at the molecular biology, then you could also see changes there too, right? So genetic differences and obvious physical differences, right? Most populations have both. However, not all variation in a population is heritable. We've already talked about that when we talked about genetics, right? As far as we're concerned in this discussion, if it's not heritable, it doesn't matter. So for, again, using the example that we've used a long time ago, somebody who works out all the time is really muscular and fit. That's good. That'll help them survive. But they did that, right? They made themselves fit. So when they have a kid, it's not like their kid's going to come out fit just because they were. Now, granted, if it's the kind of person that likes to do that and keep themselves healthy, then culturally that kid might also grow up to do the same thing, but it's not inherited genetically. So once again, it's only the genetic component of variation that is relevant to natural selection or any evolution, really. If it's not genetic, it doesn't matter. Now again, using the example I used before, things can help a population, like I said, or maybe another example would be a lot of killer whales. They have like their little pods. It's almost like a cultural thing. So they learn things. Some pods know how to do things that other pods don't. They teach their offspring that. And yes, that does help them survive, help them reproduce. But it's not technically natural selection, because they weren't born with this new knowledge, these adaptations. They're taught them, right? So it's only the genetic component, only the heritable component of variation that is relevant to natural selection. Another good example, and then I'll move on. This reminds me of some of the wrong answers I got on that lab, the peppered moth lab. Again, the black smoke didn't cause the black moths, right? It's not like a moth was white and then got covered in black smoke. I'm not sure that happened. But actually, yeah, let's assume that happened. So yes, let's assume there was a white moth who got covered with black smoke. Because of that, it was able to survive and reproduce, because it had an advantage of being covered in black and therefore camouflaged. But it wasn't heritable. So when it had offspring, they weren't black. They were all white, just like it was. Right? So it's only the genetic component that matters. Here's a picture from the old textbook, speaking of variation. This is a species of garter snakes, the same species, but they all look different. Because again, there's obvious physical differences in most populations. So here we go. Let's talk about something we've already talked about before. Let's talk about it in the context of evolution and natural selection. That is mutations. New alleles arrive from mutation. You already knew that, right? We talked about that when I first introduced mutations to you. Actually, when we first talked about alleles, that's when we first talked about that, right? It's mutations that make these new alleles. And just to remind you, what is a mutation? It is a change in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. Okay, so if you change the letters, the A's and the T's and the C's and the G's, then you might change the words, those codons. You change the words, you might change which amino acid is coming in. Change that, and you change the whole protein. But yes, these mutations are the ultimate source of genetic variation, serves as the raw material for evolution. I'm almost positive that's going to be a test question. There. The ultimate source of genetic variation that serves as the raw material for evolution. You definitely need to know that. In multicellular organisms, only mutations in cells that reproduce gametes are the ones that matter, right? So if you get, I don't know, a lot of sunburn on your arm, and that UV light causes a mutation in the cells there, it might give you cancer, but unless it spreads, that mutation is only in your arm. So whatever mutation that came up with is not going to affect your offspring. For you to affect your offspring, the radiation, like in that example, the radiation that I talked about, UV radiation, has to be in the area where you produce your sperm or your eggs. Otherwise, it won't matter. Of course, again, what's missing up here, what we're not talking about, which would have been a good bullet point before this, in single-celled organisms, which we just didn't talk about, obviously, if you're single-celled, you only have that one set of DNA. So if there's a mutation in your DNA, then when you go through reproduction, which if you're single-celled, it's probably going to be mitosis, you're going to make an exact copy of it, right? So again, single-celled organisms, that mutation is going to be passed along right away. Multicellular organisms, it has to be where we create our gametes. So any questions about that? All right. Some more stuff that you already know about mutations. So just reiterating what you already know. A change as small as a single nucleotide in a gene can have a significant effect on a phenotype. Again, using sickle cells as an example. So remember, with sickle cell, there was that one letter, the entire gene, one letter was substituted for another one. Because of that, one codon was substituted for another one. And because of that, one amino acid was substituted for another one. That's it, just one out of the whole thing. And because of that, you have this entire disease. So a random change in an organism DNA is not likely to improve its genome any more than randomly changing some words on a page are likely to improve the story. So this should almost be on 2 slides. It just takes up enough room to put it on one. This is kind of like 2 different concepts. The first concept, again, I'm saying a small change can have make a big deal, make a big difference. And the other thing I'm saying is it's usually not going to have an advantageous effect. Right? Sometimes it's harmful, more likely than not be harmful. Sometimes it can be advantageous. And that's what we're going to talk about on the next slide. Are there any questions about this slide? All right. Mutations that affect a protein's function will probably be harmful, not always, but probably. But on rare occasions, a mutated allele may improve the adaptation of individuals to its environment. So an example of that, once again, same old example, the black moth, right? They were all light colored, and this one had a mutation. Because of that mutation, it happened to create a darker color instead of a lighter color. And in that case, it improved the adaptation of that individual or of its offspring, right? So when it had dark offspring, they were more adapted to live in that dark forest. Now, granted, think about it too. If it just so happened that this wasn't happening in a polluted time and place, that would actually be not an advantage, right? So, and maybe, who knows, maybe it had happened before. Maybe that mutation happened, and then there was like a handful of dark moths in a light forest, they were just eaten so quickly that allele just disappeared. That could have happened. But again, usually it's harmful. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it can improve adaptation and enhance its reproductive success. And then the final thing to talk about that, mention about that is, this is more likely when the environment is changing in such a way that mutations that were once disadvantageous are favorable under new conditions. So again, black moth, right? It would have been bad to be a black moth in a clean, light forest. So back in the day, that would have been bad. And then along came the Industrial Revolution. Then that thing that was a disadvantage became an advantage. Sickle cell. This is what a sickle cell looks like, right here on the bottom left. These are a bunch of normal red blood cells, but can anybody tell me what those two lighter things are? And I don't expect you to know, I'm just curious. Anybody knows what those two lighter colored things are?
White blood cells?
Great guess, because those are blood cells, and they are white. But those are actually regular old red blood cells that have been affected by malaria. So what happens is malaria is a parasite that's spread by mosquitoes that gets into your cells. In a way, it's almost like a virus. And I say that because what happens is it gets inside your cell and it reproduces inside your cell. It doesn't use your cell to reproduce like a virus does, but that's where it does it until your cell explodes, and that's what you're left with, right? And then it goes on to infect your other red blood cells. So obviously malaria is a bad thing. It's killed a lot of people. Malaria, again, is spread by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are very common in sub-Saharan Africa, not dark, but moist places, right? Places with a lot of water. That's where you get mosquitoes, hot, warm places. So because of that, again, talking about things being advantage / disadvantage, in those conditions, anybody who has sickle cell disease, which again, we know is a bad thing, but if they had the sickle cell disease, they were probably not going to get malaria because their red blood cells just weren't affected by the malaria parasite. So here, all of a sudden, this thing that's a disadvantage, the sickle cell, is now an advantage. And again, this is why today, people who are descended from ancestors that came from hot tropical places with a lot of mosquitoes, they have more sickle cell per capita than the rest of us. So there you go. I wasn't given a hypothetical example with that guy, but we're running a little bit behind, so I'm not going to do that. I'll just move forward. So chromosomal mutations that delete, disrupt, or rearrange many gene loci at once are almost certain to be harmful. So the last thing we just got finished talking about was a small mutation, right? Like we changed one letter, we substituted one letter for another, right? Small substitution. Now what I'm saying is if we have big mutations, that's almost definitely going to be harmful, right? So again, stuff we just talked about, the small mutations, almost always harmful, sometimes beneficial. Here, when we're talking about big stuff, it's almost always going to be harmful. But duplication of a gene or small pieces of DNA through errors in meiosis can provide important sources of genetic variation, eventually lead to new genes with novel functions. And again, there's a lot of examples for that for humans if you want to look that up for independent work, right? What are some of our genes? That's an easy question to look up too. What are some of the genes where you have multiple copies of it? And I don't mean like alleles, like you got one copy from your mom, one from your dad. I'm saying there's some genes in our genome where it's a few different places in our genome. So instead of just being like at that one chromosome in that one area, it's they're in different places. Anyway, any questions about that side? All right. Still, we're talking about mutations. This is kind of like something I said earlier, but I'm saying it again officially with the words on the screen. In prokaryotes, which are things like bacteria, right, these single-celled organisms, mutations quickly generate genetic variations in a population. There's two reasons for this. Well, there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, bacteria are haploid. So remember, they only have one copy of their chromosome. So if their one copy has a mutation, then that's it. If anything is diploid, then yeah, their one copy might get mutated, but the other one's not. And when they go through meiosis, there's a 50-50 chance they're going to do one chromosome over the other. But again, when we're talking about anything that's haploid, you have a mutation on that one chromosome, then obviously it's going to be the one that's passed along. Yeah. And obviously bacteria reproduce very quickly. Any questions about mutations in prokaryotes? Let's talk about mutations in animals and plants. On average, there's about one mutation in every 100,000 genes per generation for animals and plants. That's from your textbook, the newest textbook. You can dig deeper into that for independent work. So I'm telling you that's the average for animals and plants. What about just animals? What about just plants? What about fungi? What about protists? Right? So basically what I'm saying is, we already talked about bacteria. What about everything else other than animals and plants? Animals and plants also have a relatively long span time between generations, right? So bacteria, they're reproducing a lot, right? Animals and plants have a relatively long time span between generations. So that one mutation in every 100,000 genes per generation might be a while. Speaking of which, speaking of today's attendance words, it's my daughter's birthday, right? So, and she still hasn't reproduced. So she's 23, but she has one mutation in every 100,000 of her genes. That mutation still hasn't even gone to the next generation yet. Because again, that long time span between generations. Also, having a diploid genome prevents most mutations from significantly affecting the genetic variation from one generation to the next. Like we already said, if you have two copies of each, at least two copies of each gene, then if you mutate one, and the other one's okay, again, as you know from meiosis, there's a 50-50 chance that you're going to send this chromosome as opposed to that chromosome, right? There's homologous chromosomes. You might get the mom version or the dad version. If your mutation is on the mom's version, you might get that one or you might not. Any questions about that side? All right. Let's talk about sexual reproduction. Again, I think we can go through this pretty quickly because this is basically restating everything I've already taught you, except we're just looking at it in a different context. Just like mutations. I already taught you about mutations, and then we just looked at mutations and how they affect evolution. Now we're going to do the same thing with sexual reproduction. You already know about sexual reproduction, but look at what it means when it comes to evolution. So sexually, I'm missing a word there, reproducing organisms, or for sexually reproducing organisms, most genetic variation in populations come from a unique combination of alleles that are inherited from each generation, right? So a fresh assortment of existing alleles arise every generation from three random components, as you already know about. First of all, there's independent assortment. To remind you, what that means is, again, when those homologous chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell during meiosis, it isn't as if it's doing what I'm doing here, which is all mom on one side and dad on the other, right? They line up independently of each other. And for us, we're having 23 pairs. There's 23 different ways, each, where they could swap, right? So mom on one side, dad on the other. They line up independent of each other. That's independent assortment, as you already know. Then there's crossing over. And remember, it's going to be horrible drawing. Once again, once those homologous chromosomes are close to each other, sometimes they touch. Of course, this is kind of hard to illustrate with the same color, but you can see this spot right here where they're touching. They might just swap chunks. So you might have a mom organ or a mom chromosome that has a little dad chunk on it. Meanwhile, the dad chromosome will have a little mom chunk on it. And remember, like I told you, sometimes it never happens. Sometimes it happens once. Sometimes it happens more than once. Sometimes it's big chunks. Sometimes it's small chunks. Right? Sometimes it's this part of the chromosome. Sometimes it's that part. It's always random. So you add independent assortment to crossing over. Then you add random fertilization, and this is where we have all this fresh assortment of existing alleles, right? This genetic variation. This is where it comes from for sexually reproducing organisms. Stuff you already knew, but now I'm just reiterating it and saying, hey, this is where it comes from. Obviously, mutation is the ultimate source, right? But then once we have those mutations, we're saying this is how they all get all mixed up as sexually reproducing organisms. Any questions about that slide? All right, the next slide is very simple but important. Or the next topic, we are talking about the populations as the units of evolution. This is important. It will definitely be a test question. And I think there may have already been some questions in a maybe quiz, not a quiz. You get that question, maybe in a lab. But anyway, individuals do not evolve, right? The evolutionary impact of natural selection is only apparent in the changes of populations over time. Okay, so again, using those black moths as an example, nowhere in that scenario did a light moth turn into a black moth, right? What happened was a light moth gave birth, a light moth produced some dark moths, and those things happen to have advantage, but no moth changed color because natural selection happens on a population, not act on individuals. What is a population? You need to know this, and we're going to reiterate this from now until the end of the semester because we're going to say it in different contexts. But a population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and are breeding together. So, and again, they have to be in the same area and breeding together technically to be considered a population. This is why the population of gray squirrels in West Virginia is different than a population of gray squirrels in Tallahassee. They might be the same species, but they're really far apart from each other. So they're not interbreeding. So they're the same species, but they're not the same population. Of course, that's more important to reiterate later when we talk about a population in different contexts. In this context, the important thing to understand about a population is it's not an individual, right? It's a group of individuals. Because, again, natural selection does not act on an individual. Right? You see the changes of natural selection in a population. So different populations of the same species may be geographically isolated from each other, like the squirrels I just talked about. And because of that, the exchange of genetic material may never or rarely occur. Just like the squirrels I talked about. Now, granted, it's very possible some squirrel fools around and finds itself on a train in West Virginia, and it doesn't get off until it gets to Tallahassee, right? So it's possible, but it's very rare. And such isolation is common in populations confined to different lakes or islands. The next slide, I'm going to give you a good example of that. Before I do, does anybody have any questions about what a population is? All right. So again, imagine this. Here we have a bunch of different lakes. So imagine if at one point that, maybe there was more water and that was one big lake. Maybe these 3 lakes used to be one big lake, right? So then you had one population of a certain species of fish. And then when the water level dropped, it's still the same species, but now they're technically in 3 different lakes. And for the most part, they're not breeding with each other. Sure, occasionally some person might catch a fish here and release it there. Maybe a bird swoops in and catches the fish here and accidentally drops it there. Occasionally, there might be some movement of the genes of the population, but generally speaking, they are separated, right? And even though this isn't the point your textbook was getting at, another good way to think about this too is imagine, again, they used to be the same species, the same population living in one big lake, and now they're in 3 different lakes. Let's say, I'm just saying this hypothetically, maybe this one's really deep, obviously it's bigger. Maybe this one's really shallow. Maybe this one's really salty, or I don't know, whatever. Point is, they're all very different, right? So imagine you have 3 different populations now, and over time, those populations are going to become very different because they're in different environments. They're probably hiding from different predators, probably eating different food, probably laying their eggs in different places, dealing with different temperatures, different pH, different oxygen saturation, right? So eventually, over time, that would lead to new species. But anyway, I digress. Let's get back to this. At the population level, biologists focus on the gene pool. And that might also be a test question. What is a gene pool? It consists of all copies of every type of allele in every locus and all members of the population. A different way of thinking about that is, think about it. You all know what your genome is, right? It's all your DNA, right? Your A's, your C's, and T's, and G's. It's your entire genome. So a gene pool is like the genome, except for it's not just one individual, it's all the individuals' genomes combined. That's what a gene pool is, and that's what we're going to study. Not study necessarily, but when we come back, I'm not going to get into that. We're about 6 minutes left. So when we come back on Friday, we will talk about analyzing gene pools, which you're already slightly familiar with from the Hardy-Weinberg lab that we did. Speaking of labs, I'll remind you again, we're not meeting in the lab today because it's just a video. There's no reason for us to be here. I think that's it. So last word for attendance is happy birthday. Of course, I guess that's 2 words, but yeah. Anyway, That's it. You guys have a good day, and I'll see you on Friday.